Good day. Over the last 24 hours, news from the Ukrainian battlefronts has again been rather thin, though it does seem that the Ukrainian military, has made various counterattacks, has engaged in various counterattacks along the Donbass front lines in an attempt, I would say perhaps a desperate attempt, to retrieve what looks like an increasingly deteriorating situation. Now, Russian reports, which have generally proved accurate in the past when describing this kind of fighting, claim that all of these Ukrainian attacks have been repulsed and thrown back. There is some suggestions that near Bakhmut, fighting is still going on and that the Ukrainians are still trying to press some kind of counterattack along there, though the reports also say that this attack is not having much success at the moment. But it does look as if this attempt is still taking place there, and obviously it's something that I can't say definitely as at the time of the making of this program that, this counterattack has conclusively failed, though I suspect we will get reports shortly that it has. And by the way, this has been the consistent pattern of the fighting in Donbass, basically ever since it got seriously underway back in May. The Russians make incremental advances, the Ukrainians try to counterattack, the Russians throw the counterattacks back, they then consolidate, and then after they've consolidated, they make more advances still. It's a slow grind, as we've discussed many times, as Russian commanders have discussed many times, but it is an inexorable one. And I'm going to add that there's some reports which suggest that over the last few weeks, the tempo of these advances has actually increased. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a moment, because obviously we've now had a claim from Haines, the Director of National Intelligence in the United States, which suggests the opposite. But as I'm going to point out, what she is saying is contradicted by the events that we've actually seen over the last couple of days and perhaps week or so. But anyway, we'll come to Haines shortly. Now, there was some more news yesterday which suggested that these attempts by Ukraine to try to push back the Russians after they've gained ground are going to run into even greater problems. Because I have seen one report, again it seems to come from a Greek source, that the Russians, since General Surovikin took charge of things, have not only been consolidating their control of places that they capture, but they're doing something from a Ukrainian point of view, I suspect is going to be even more alarming. And that is that they're now building their own counter-fortifications. And apparently these are very elaborate. In other words, they're constructing their own trenches, they're building their own pillboxes, they're setting their own tank traps and tank obstructions, they're laying their own minefields. They're doing this even as they edge forward. They are, in effect, creating a shield, a fortified shield, ahead of themselves as they advance. And then they use these fortifications that they create as a launch point for their next advance. And that means that when the Ukrainians do counterattack, and they try to on a fairly regular basis, what they find is they run up against these heavy Russian fortified lines. It's a painstaking way to conduct war. It's in some ways, I suppose, a labor-intensive and way of conducting war as well. You have to deploy large numbers of construction workers and combat engineers to the war zone to build these fortifications. But, by the way, and for the historical record, it is not something that is entirely new. Now, you can come up with many examples of where the same thing has been done in the past, but perhaps the one that stands out for me personally, as somebody who was born in Greece and therefore is familiar with the history of the Balkans, is of the Russian-Turkish War of the 1870s, where a Russian general called Todleben, who was also an engineer, basically won that war on behalf of Russia by doing precisely this. The Russians were fighting a difficult battle to try to capture a fortified city which the Turks had built up called Plevna. I believe that's in Bulgaria, by the way, and the fighting was primarily conducted in Bulgaria, as I remember. It proved a difficult fortress city to capture. Todleben was eventually put in charge. He approached the siege of Plevna, as it was, in exactly this kind of a way that Surovikin seems to be doing with Bakhmut. So just as Ukraine has apparently built a heavy fortified belt around Bakhmut, it's basically turned Bakhmut itself into a sort of fortified city, a fortress city. Surovikin is doing the same thing that Todleben did all those years ago, more than a century ago, 150 years ago, during the siege of Plevna. He too built heavy fortified lines. He gradually ground the Ottoman Turkish army down in Plevna, just as Surovikin seems to be trying to do around Bakhmut and in Donbass. And Todleben's strategy was extremely effective. Plevna was eventually captured. The Ottoman Turkish army in the Balkans was smashed, and the Russians were able to advance all the way to the Straits and arrived opposite the Turkish capital of Constantinople, Istanbul as it is now. And then they dictated peace terms, which, however, were revised shortly after in the Congress of Berlin. Now, how do I know all of this? I repeat again, this is my part of the world, the Balkans, and once upon a time, certainly in the Balkans, and I think still in Bulgaria, especially, Bulgaria gained its independence from the Ottomans as a result of this war. As a result of the fact that this is very much our history, it is a particular war that I remember very well, that used to be very well known in my part of the world. And Todleben, who I think is a general, little known in the West, in the Balkans at a certain time, certainly when my childhood, was still a famous name that people still talked about. So there's an example of the Russians doing this sort of thing in the past, and they seem to be doing it again now, or at least that's what some of these reports imply. Now, I want to stress again, it's always difficult to get detailed information about what's going on in the fighting in Donbass. And this does look plausible to me. It is consistent with things that Surovikin has said. And it is, of course, a time-consuming and labor-intensive, but perhaps arguably cost-effective way of conducting this war. Probably a lot more cost-effective than direct assaults on heavily fortified positions, which, by the way, the Russians have never engaged in at any point in this conflict. So there it is, an inexorable approach which the Russians appear to believe is going to achieve its desired result, the fall of Bakhmut, according to some Russian officials, sometime this month. Now, all of that, as I said, it's based on rather sketchy information, but we are getting more reports from the Western media, all of which now appear to confirm that Ukraine is facing a serious crisis in the Bakhmut area of Donbass. And there's now been a report in an Italian newspaper, I believe it was Corriere della Sera, another newspaper, by the way, which takes a very, very fiercely pro-Ukrainian line. As I remember, it even at one point posted, earlier in the conflict, posted a photograph of a Ukrainian missile strike, or what most people think was a Ukrainian missile strike, and claimed that it was a Russian strike. That's happened months ago. Perhaps we shouldn't dwell on it too much. Everybody makes mistakes. But anyway, they are a very strongly pro-Ukrainian newspaper, as, by the way, most of the Italian media is. Anyway, one of their reporters has toured the battle lines. He hasn't, as far as I can tell, been to Bakhmut itself, but he's been to Konstantinovka, which is a place in the immediate rear. He visited a military hospital, or a hospital where wounded people are being treated. He said that Ukraine is receiving is sending 150 wounded soldiers there every day. And this correspondent saw at least 4 Ukrainian soldiers, one after the other, who were having major operations. If my memory serves me correctly, they were having part of their limbs amputated, which suggests a shocking state of things. And there was also talk about blood everywhere, and really very, very hideous and frightful things going on in this particular part of the conflict zone. Now, that's one hospital, one area, but there's other reports, these I cannot confirm, that hospitals are overflowing, that in this area, in this conflict area, the soldiers are having to be sent further to other places, that they're having to be treated there, that Ukraine is having severe problems keeping up with the needs to keep their wounded treated, and that this is now having a severe impact. And there was a flood of messages that I got, and of course a lot of comments on the threads of the thread of my video of yesterday, following on from that article in the British newspaper, the Daily Express, which reported the comments of Piotr Kuzik, a Ukrainian commander of the Svoboda battalion, who was describing the grim conditions in which his soldiers were having to fight under enormous pressure from the Russians, in trenches that get regularly flooded, in cold conditions, in very wet conditions. And one of the particularly harrowing things about these comments is that many of them came from people who are descended from British soldiers, most of them were British soldiers who'd fought through the First World War. And of course it wasn't just soldiers, not just descendants, but other people. And they discussed these messages discussed some of the effects of fighting in these kind of conditions. And, this is setting it aside from injuries from shells and that kind of thing. And there was much talk about pneumonia. Well, Kuzik specifically referred to pneumonia, but also conditions like trench foot. I'm not going to describe what that is. You can look it up if you wish. It's pretty awful. And other things like that people contract if they're kept in trenches in that kind of way. And you can, by the way, go to the thread of my previous video and you will find some of the comments about it there. And I have to say, when I read this account about people in this hospital in, I believe, Konstantinovka, having limbs amputated, it did make me think, it did make me wonder whether we aren't getting more and more cases of people who are suffering from conditions like trench foot and that might have been what this reporter was seeing, even if he didn't fully understand it. Now, I have to say, and I'm going to repeat again, I cannot fully fathom how it is possible today, in the 21st century, more than 100 years after the First World War, to expose soldiers in the battlefields to these kind of conditions. And I ask again this question: is it reasonable for Ukraine to expect its men to fight and die and be injured and experience this sort of thing? Well, I would have thought not. The option for negotiation, as I said, is still there, though I do wonder for how long. And surely what Ukraine is experiencing, what its soldiers are experiencing on the battlefields in places like Bakhmut and in the areas around it, are a compelling reason to seek peace, and for anybody who really cares about Ukraine to urge Ukraine to seek peace. Anyway, I make this point because there's far too little reporting about the real conditions of this conflict in the Western media. There seems to be, on the contrary, a preference to sort of talk about these wars, as if this war, as if it's happening in some kind of abstract way, as if people aren't actually dying, as if people aren't actually getting wounded, as if they aren't experiencing the horrors that Ukrainian soldiers are going through in Bakhmut. Now, I've discussed other similar events, similar things that have happened previously in earlier stages of the war, of the fighting. Well, this is what we're seeing. This is what reports are telling us is happening in and around Bakhmut. And to be frank, that article in the Daily Express was unusual. It was very much an exception to the rule of how British reporting of the war takes place. And I think there should be an awful lot more of that. And I think if people in the West were properly informed about what is actually going on in this war, well, I suspect that feelings about this war would change, and change very fast. Anyway, that is one thing to say. Now, just two further points. General Surovikin, about, I think it was over a month ago now, said in his one and only interview to Russian television that he would grind Ukraine's military down. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, spoke about the meat grinder through which the Russians are putting Ukraine through in Bakhmut. Well, those are words. These articles in the Daily Express, in Corriere della Sera, if it was Corriere della Sera, in the Italian media, they tell us what these words actually mean, what Surovikin's grinding machine, what Prigozhin's meat grinder are actually doing. And it is terrible, but it is what is happening. It is how this war is being fought. And let us be absolutely clear, from a Russian point of view, it is how this war is being won. Now, let's come back to Avril Haines. Avril Haines, as I said, is the Director of National Intelligence. She made a speech at something called the Ronald Reagan Institute, which I freely admit I've never heard of up till this point, but there are so many of these institutes, think tanks, bodies now, which are proliferated across the West, that I've long since given up trying to keep on top of them. And she said that the tempo of the war has slowed down and will continue to do so during the winter, as both sides supposedly restore their combat effectiveness, they refresh, they rebuild, they reorganize, they reinforce until sometime presumably in the spring, when offensives by Russia and counter-offensives by Ukraine will allegedly resume. Well, that's what Haines said. How does this reporting that we've just had from the Daily Express, from Corriere della Sera, if it really was Corriere della Sera, how does it correspond with our picture? How is it possible to talk about a decline in tempo when people are dying and getting wounded in this way? When one hospital, one area of the battlefields is reporting 150 wounded in one day, when one reporter sees operations carried out to apparently amputate limbs on 4 people, one after the other. I mean, what is this talk about? A reduction in tempo. And of course, we're actually looking at the situation on the battlefronts. Well, as I discussed a couple of days ago, what has actually happened is that the Russians have actually achieved significant advances around Bakhmut. They've captured 4 settlements, one after the other on the trot. They're now, according to what the Russians say, and there doesn't seem to be much dispute about this, they are in a position to shell all the roads leading to Bakhmut. The railway lines are apparently also facing severe problems. So clearly, there's no decline in the tempo there. On the contrary, I would say that over the last couple of weeks, the tempo, if anything, has increased. What Haines, of course, means is that there's not been any big advances. And if you're measuring advances in terms of kilometers and tens of kilometers and that sort of thing, that is true. But if you are measuring it in terms of the numbers of people who are getting killed, and to be very clear, those tend to be heavily or increasingly Ukrainians. Ukrainian losses are much heavier than Russian losses. Well, then it seems that the situation, far from getting better, far from the tempo declining, it's getting worse. So I want to make that point. I think that Haines, if this is what she really thinks, is perhaps becoming delusional. And I wonder whether, when she talks about reinforcements and resupplies and all that kind of thing, and where is Ukraine getting all these resupplies and reorganizations and reinforcements? Little sign of them, certainly nothing comparable to what we're seeing on the Russian side, where people like Colonel McGregor are saying that with the 300,000 reservists now brought into the Russian military, well, certainly no sign there of Ukraine getting reinforced on anything like the scale that the Russians are. So again, I do question what Haines is saying, how factually correct it is. Obviously, she is the Director of National Intelligence, and I am not. Perhaps she has information that isn't available to me. I'm not sure what that information is. All I am saying that the reports I am seeing from the ground, and note, I'm citing in this program Western media reports from Western correspondents. Well, they're telling a different story. Now, Haines said something else. She apparently also said that it is impossible for protests to shake or overthrow the government of Russia. The Russian government, Mr. Putin's government, is in secure control of the country. Putin's current ratings, by the way, or trust rating is, I believe, 78%, which is pretty stable. it doesn't look as if, and Haines herself accepts this, there's going to be any change in the Russian government anytime soon, certainly not as a result of any of the events that we've seen, any of the pressures that we've seen imposed by the West. And Haines, mind you, said that directly after the G7 decision to impose this $60 a barrel oil price cap on Russian oil. Clearly, Avril Haines doesn't believe that that's going to have any political effect on the Russians either, which begs the question of why in that case has it been done. So it looks like the Russians are digging in for a slow grind. They're grinding Ukraine down in the way that Surovikin said. If it's true they're building all those fortifications, even in areas where they're advancing, then one can understand better why Ukrainian casualties are so high. And by the way, as many people, including I noticed people with military backgrounds, were saying both in the thread to my previous video and also as I saw in private emails, it looks as if Ukraine rushing all these reinforcements to try to hold the line is simply reinforcing failure at the expense of Ukrainian lives and is playing into the strategy of grinding Ukraine down, which General Surovikin and Yevgeny Prigozhin and other Russians have outlined. So that's where we are. And of course, if Bakhmut does indeed fall over the next few weeks, this month, as I have to say, all the evidence suggests is not only possible, but perhaps likely, well, then we are going to see significant changes in the war in Donbass. I discussed yesterday why the British Ministry of Defence has claimed that this would be only a symbolic victory. Makes absolutely no sense and is contradicted by the British Ministry of Defence's own admission that the fall of Bakhmut opens the way for the capture of places like Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which are the two remaining important cities in Donbass, which continue to be under Ukrainian control. So there we go. That's the situation. A real grinding machine, perhaps worse than what we saw in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk over the course of the summer, with the Russians piling up the pressure all the time, and with, by the way, still more reports trickling in of a massive Russian missile strike in preparation, timed for who knows when, whenever the Russians decide that it works to their best advantage. So, let's take a step back. Let's think where we are with all of this. A grinding down of Ukrainian forces. Why is Avril Haines talking in this way? Why is she claiming that the tempo of the war has slowed when in fact the casualty rate, at least the Ukrainian casualty rate, is intensifying? Why is she talking about Ukraine reinforcing when most people who are looking at the situation are agreed that Ukraine is basically maxed out in terms of the forces it can deploy? Its military is smaller than it was a few weeks ago, a few months ago. It probably peaked in late August, early September. It's now reduced, not so much to reinforcing in order to increase its size. It's basically trying as hard as it can to replace its losses. And as we've seen, It's struggling to replace weapon systems that it's lost. It's suffering ammunition shortages and all of those things. Why is Haines talking about a slowing of the tempo when I can't help but think, despite what I said before, that she must know that the story, the reality is different? Well, I'm going to give my own personal view. I think the US, Western governments, or at least some Western governments, are fully aware of how bad the situation in Ukraine is becoming. And what they want to do is that they want to try to use the remaining time over the next few weeks before some kind of visible crisis, indisputable crisis, happens in Donbass, to try to get some kind of negotiations on track with the Russians. So we saw Macron going to the United States. We saw Biden for the first time floating the possibility of direct negotiations between himself and Putin. We saw Olaf Scholz telephoning Putin and trying apparently to get some kind of negotiations back on track again, and getting chewed up by Putin in that fiery call that I discussed some days ago. We've now had more comments from Macron, of all people. He's again said that when the war is over, the Russians need to be provided with security guarantees. Again, he was saying all of this before the war began. He was talking again about some kind of, he's talking again in his usual grandiose way about some kind of new security architecture for Europe, which will include Russia. He accepts that the Russians have genuine reasons to feel insecure as a result of the NATO expansion process. But he won't, of course, come up with any actual proposals for how this new security architecture will be shaped. And of course, the Russians, as I well remember, back in December of last year, they had many meetings with Macron. Putin had long meetings with him in the Kremlin. They spoke extensively over the phone. And Macron was talking the same story that he's talking now, but he came back empty-handed. And it's clear to me, it became very clear to me, that the point eventually came when the Russians lost patience with him, and all the indications that I have seen are that the Russians continue to feel that this is somebody who just talks a big talk, but has absolutely nothing in reality to offer. So whether Macron understands that or not, I don't know. But anyway, he's talking again about the need to recreate a great, grandiose security architecture. And we have Scholz coming along with his own comments that, once the war is over, once we've found some kind of solution, once the conflict is done, well, we can go back to the status quo ante. We can go back to the situation which existed in Europe before the war began, when the Russians and the Germans were talking with each other. He doesn't say whether Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 would be back up and running. I mean, he's not going to discuss those difficult topics. I mean, Scholz never discusses difficult topics. But again, he seems to be trying to tell the Russians, let's do peace. Let's go back to how things were. We're open to that. You are going to find that if we go back, if you engage us in that kind of a way, we are receptive. We will lift all our sanctions. We'll find some way of reconciling with you. And we have Haines, and I'm going to say this straight away. I think the most important thing that Haines said was not her completely wrong comment that the tempo is slowing. I think what she the really important part of what she said was that the fall of the Russian government as a result of protests is impossible. In other words, Putin is here to stay, the Russian government is here to stay, and we've got to find some way of talking to these people, and any hope, any belief, any expectation that things can change isn't really going to crystallize. So we see Western leaders, in their own overcomplicated ways, all trying to find some way before the crash in Ukraine comes, trying to use the next few weeks or perhaps months. I don't know how long this is going to take before the Russians begin their winter offensive, before the Ukrainian economy goes into a tailspin, before the bigger Russian missile strikes, before the attacks on the bridges, if they're really part of the Russian plan, that the Western leaders are now, all of them, or at least the important ones, the ones that matter, Biden, Scholz, Macron, that they're now all talking this game of trying to get some kind of negotiation going. And to be clear, they wouldn't be doing this, in my opinion, if they really thought Ukraine was winning. Now, there are further reasons why they are probably being pushed into doing this. All the indications are that economic conditions in Europe particularly are going to get worse over the course of 2023. It's been pointed out by any number of people that gas supplies in Europe are going to start running even more short in 2023 than they have been in 2022. As it happens, there's been little electricity produced from the wind because the air has been fairly still in Europe over the last few weeks, and the windmills haven't been turning as fast as they're supposed to. So there's been more gas taken out of the underground gas reserves, and of course the temperatures right across Europe, and indeed in Britain as well, are now falling, and energy use therefore is increasing. And there is no real option now to replenish those reserves from Russian gas, because of course the pipelines are all cut. Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 have been knocked out of commission. The Yamal pipeline isn't working. There's problems now with the Ukrainian system as well. So the Europeans can't do what they did back in 2022, the spring and summer of 2022. They can't refill their reserves by cranking up purchases of Russian gas. And there's further reasons to think that this is all going to get very difficult next year, because it looks like the Chinese government, very much as we predicted on the Duran, is now responding both to the pressures within China, which were manifested in those protests and other things, by now gradually reopening China and ending its pandemic restriction measures, as I will call them. And there's been a major steps by the Chinese government announcing that lockdowns in Chinese cities are going to be softened. The Chinese government is now engaging in a big reflation exercise within China itself to try to get the economy moving faster again. If China, of course, does start to grow, its economy starts cranking up speed again over the course of 2023, then it will be competing for liquefied natural gas with the Europeans. And the Chinese have the deep pockets and, of course, they've made friends. They've got the Russians on side. The Russians have to sell gas now to China because the Europeans have taken away the choice for the Russians of selling their gas to Europe. So the Russians will be getting more of the gas from Russia that might once upon a time have gone to Europe. But it's not just the Russians. Qatar now seems to be tilting towards selling more of its liquefied natural gas to China instead of Europe. That seems to be the policy of the Qatar government. And of course, later, a few weeks' time, nobody seems to know exactly when, Xi Jinping himself is coming to Saudi Arabia to meet with the Arab leaders of the Arab states, not just the Saudis. And he's going to, no doubt, forge ahead with some policy on energy policy, with the Saudis and other countries, other Middle East energy producers now looking increasingly, or so it seems to me, towards China as the major partner on energy questions. And of course, we've also had Mr. Putin on his part. He's sorting out his energy hub plans, these gas hub plans, with President Erdogan of Turkey. And he's discussed with President Tokayev of Kazakhstan and obtained Kazakhstan's and Uzbekistan's agreement on setting up a gas union, a union of gas producers. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are on board. We discussed this, Alex Christophoro and I, extensively in a video on the Duran, and it looks very likely, increasingly likely, or so it seems to me, that if this gas union idea takes off, which I see no reason why it wouldn't, that other gas producers will also climb on board, so that, of course, we will probably have a kind of gas OPEC coming across, appearing over the horizon before very long. So, highly likely we're going to start to see more problems with energy in Europe, especially next year. And I'm going to add, by the way, that the oil price cap idea on Russian oil is probably going to make matters worse. I discussed in my program yesterday how one response to the oil price cap might have been for the Russians to cut production. Actually, to cut oil production, and there's been reports in the British media that the Russians could cut oil production by up to 3 million barrels a day without this affecting their oil production infrastructure. And of course, that would cause a very significant rise in oil prices. I've said that I don't think the Russians are going to do that because obviously they don't want to annoy their newfound friends in India and China and those places. But it isn't just the Russians who are angry with this oil price cap idea. OPEC Plus met yesterday and a decision was made to keep production at current levels. And that is what I expected. But it was very interesting that in the run-up to that meeting, in the hours up prior to that meeting, reports were circulating, not just in Russia, but in the Middle East, that the oil producers were actually contemplating a production cut, that they might cut production as a direct response to the oil price cap on Russian oil. And I've discussed the reason why other oil producers might not like that. And it's a reason, by the way, that the Russians have gone out of their way in publicizing to all oil producers. And that is that if the Western powers were to be successful in imposing a price cap on Russian oil, they would no doubt before long try to extend that price cap on oil produced by other producers as well. In other words, the entire OPEC plus cartel has a vested interest in ensuring that this particular price cap idea fails, a fact which Western leaders don't seem to have internalized or understood. Now, as I said, I don't think the producers at the moment are really looking at production cuts. I don't think that they particularly want to raise the price of oil at this particular time. The reason is, again, the one I've just said. They don't want to see China, India, those countries which are sympathetic to the oil producers, they don't want to see them discomforted at this time. I think that the policy at the moment is to try to keep oil prices as stable as possible. I think that suits everybody's interests. But with China increasing probably its production, its imports of gas and of oil, competing directly with the West, with structural problems now in the oil market, because the Europeans especially will have to pay a premium for the oil they import. The United States will not be so affected because it produces nearly all its oil. Well, inevitably, that's going to create more problems for European energy consumers. And then, of course, there are likely to be some further military developments. Now, the United States has basically ruled out the idea, as far as I can tell, of supplying more advanced weapon systems to Ukraine. The idea of supplying Patriot systems, for example, seems to have been ruled out. But I'm now hearing reports that the Russians, for their part, are becoming increasingly confident that they're able to cope with whatever weapon systems the United States has supplied up to this point. Some of them, to be frank, like the Javelin, the Stinger missiles, the Javelin anti-tank missile, the Stinger anti-aircraft missile, haven't performed especially well anyway. The weapon system that has attracted the most publicity, the HIMARS system, well, it was an effective system when it was first deployed back in August. With every month that's passed, its effectiveness appears to have declined. The Russians are now saying, apparently, that they're now introducing a new software package to their air defense systems, and that this will reduce the effectiveness of the HIMARS system even further. And there are, by the way, also reports that HIMARS missiles are now in increasingly short supply. The United States is unhappy with the profligate way in which Ukraine launches these things. That seems to contradict, by the way, claims that the United States supervises the launch of HIMARS missiles, but never mind. But overall, one gets the sense that the United States is not going to be able to supply many more of these systems, at least not in the short term, and that those that still exist and still to be found in Ukraine are becoming less effective. So, one can understand why, with the military situation becoming more difficult, with the effectiveness of Western weapons becoming perhaps reduced, with complaints apparently being made to Macron that he's already weakened the French military position significantly by the excessive amount of weapons that he has sent to Ukraine. Well, and of course with pending problems with energy in Europe, one can begin to understand why there might be an interest in getting some kind of negotiations with the Russians started, and that would explain the various overtures. The overtures by Biden, by Macron, and by Scholz, and Haines's assurance that, yes, we've still got a little time, enough time left to get this going, and also her reminder that Mr. Putin is here to stay. The problem is It's a complete lack of ideas. There's no real idea of how to get out of this situation. One gets the sense that people like Scholz and Macron, at some level, perhaps not in their conscious minds, but deep down, understand that this isn't working out very well. But of course, there's that huge panoply of hardliners who are still incredibly resistant to any idea of negotiations. Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, who is one of the most fervid supporters and promoters of the neocon positions in the United States and who has played a very active role in Ukrainian affairs, she's just been in Kiev. And one can't assume anything other than that she's urging Ukraine to take as hard a line as possible and to continue the war, despite the terrible losses that Ukraine is suffering. And there's one other party which is clearly signalling its deep unhappiness with all of these overtures, and that is Britain. Notice that the British, once again, are not involved in any part of the diplomatic process. Just as happened when the Minsk agreement was negotiated back in 2015, people are talking about negotiations with the Russians, and they are sidelining Britain. And the British, for their part, are deeply unhappy about this, and they're making that fact increasingly clear. And we have comments from the British Foreign Minister, Mr. Cleverly, telling us about how negotiations would be ill-conceived at this time. And there's been articles in the Daily Telegraph, of all places, the editorials of the Daily Telegraph, basically criticising the actions of Western governments, the United States, well, Mr. Biden himself, Joe Biden himself, and the French and the Germans, who seem to be pushing for negotiations. So there is still this panoply of people who are opposed to compromise. And I haven't even started with the Poles and the Baltic states and with people like Stoltenberg and the rest. So, talk of negotiations, admissions that Putin is here to stay, but no fresh thinking at all. And in the meantime, Ukraine is bleeding. Bleeding every day, even as the Russians get stronger. I've said before, and I'm going to say it again, this whole affair from the outset, this whole Ukrainian business, what it shows is the extent of the bankruptcy of Western policy and of Western diplomacy. It is a tragedy for Ukraine, first and foremost, for the people of Europe, who are now increasingly suffering, and for the West generally. Now, I'm going to finish with one brief word about the situation in my own country, in Britain. Now, I did so with some apology, because I do appreciate that a lot of you are from Britain. A lot of you who follow me are indeed from Britain. Most of you are not, and I'm not under any illusions about how interesting Britain is to most of you. But Britain is my own country. And I discussed a few days ago how Sunak's speech to the City of London, the Lord Mayor's banquet speech, which British Prime Ministers regularly make, how, in fact, how evasive it was, how it appeared to say one thing and actually said something else. Well, I've noticed that there's increasing amount of commentary about this in Britain itself. Now, nobody as far as I'm aware, has parsed any part of Sunak's speech as carefully as I did. But I've now seen commentaries in several places. There's an interesting one this morning by Simon Tisdall, of all people, in The Guardian, all pointing out how shifty and evasive on various matters and how empty of ideas Sunak actually was. And there's increasing talk across the media that Britain has a weak, out-of-touch Prime Minister leading a weak, out-of-touch government that is drifting with events, that's lost control of events internally, domestically in Britain. We're on top of the economic crisis. We're now facing a strike wave, but it's also losing control of its foreign policy, is becoming increasingly irrelevant in foreign policy terms. And again, I think that all of these commentaries that you see on the foreign policy issues, they miss the key point. They are still excessively focused on the Brexit question, which I'm not going to debate further in this programme. They miss, however, the fact that the major crisis in Europe today is not Brexit and all of that. It is Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine. If the British have nothing new to say, if they have no real ideas about how this crisis can be brought under control, if they stick to the sort of line that Boris Johnson was taking, which has led us, in my opinion, in Britain, down this cul-de-sac, now we should not be surprised if we become increasingly irrelevant, as even other Western leaders try to find some way out. Historically, the British were always at the forefront of trying to find solutions, diplomatic solutions to problems in Europe. That was what the British did. Sometimes they didn't do it very well. Sometimes they made things worse through their meddling and interventions. But generally speaking, they were always a force for compromise in European conflicts. Well, if we have absolutely nothing new to say, no one is going to take any interest in us, and it's unsurprising in that case that people see us increasingly as an irrelevant, clapped out country with a Prime Minister who is every bit as weak and directionless as people say. Well, that's all I'm going to discuss in this programme. We'll be no doubt hearing a lot more on the Bakhmut front over the next few days. We'll see whether these Ukrainian counterattacks achieve anything. We'll see how General Surovikin's grinding machine continues to work. But anyway, that's me for the day. Just to remind you all again that you can find all my programs and all the Duran programs on our other platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Telegram, and Rockfin. And you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You shouldn't forget to look up our shop where we have all sorts of great things that you can find: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all of those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.